Hi, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite assessments. I've actually done this assessment this will be my fifth year. I'm actually giving this assessment at the end of the week since we are working on fables and folk tales and retelling lessons. So, very excited. Um, so, this assessment goes along with the Kentucky State Standards, um, Kentucky RL 2.2, which is determining author's message, lesson learned, or moral, with fables, folk tales, and other stories from different diverse cultures. Um, so, this is always really fun to add in a lot of the fables and stories from different cultures as well. And then the English language proficiency standards, there were two that really do tie into this, and that really do help me assess their level of language. So the first one being that they can construct meaning from literary presentation. So they can do this by either listening, reading, or watching a story. They're able to construct meaning and understanding of what that story is. So if they are able to retell this story, by listening, viewing, or watching, that tells me a lot about where they're at language wise, from their listening standpoint, um, reading standpoint, how much academic language do they have when it comes to reading a text. And then the next one, speak and write about grade appropriate topics. So they're able to speak and write about the lesson or the moral, which also shows me a lot about their language proficiency and their language growth. Are they able to take the understanding that they found from the first standard, from that text that they were reading, and are they able to speak or write or show anything about it? Um, so this assessment really measures all three of these standards, and not only shows me a lot about how our students able to identify lesson, but are they able to um, use their understanding of the English language to present it and understand it. So the assessment, students retell a fable of their choosing that they will read or listen to. So they will choose a fable. They have a selection to choose from. I'll give them a couple, and then they will either have a teacher read it to them. They will listen to it if that's available, or they will read it on their own. So that's differentiated for them. And then after they listen to it, they will retell their fable, and they will determine the lesson or the moral. And they can choose different ways to retell and determine this moral. So first, they can do it orally. So they can use, a lot of the time, they like to use Flipgrid, but sometimes they will just choose to perform it verbally. Um, they can also do it visually. So they like pictures. They can do it in a comic strip or a storyboard format where they will use detailed illustrations to explain and retell their story and draw the lesson. They can write, so they can just do a written retelling with the lesson, or they can choose to act. Whoops. They can choose to act, um, which is another way of them presenting orally, but it's a little bit more fun and it's framed in a different way. A lot of the times, if they will act, I let them use their native language. If needed, if they feel uncomfortable, they can use their native language, but they can also work with a partner on this one. But most of my kids pick visual. That is one of the more popular ones. So how is this applicable for all levels of ELL students? So because I have always taught in an EL heavy classroom, anywhere from 15 to 20 EL students, they've always been taken into consideration. So throughout this entire assessment, to start with, students, based on their language, can read or they can listen to a text. Now, I encourage most of my kids to read. If they can, I'll give them differentiated levels of text. So it is not always second grade level. But for students who are newcomers or who have low language proficiency, oftentimes I will let them watch or view or listen to a fable. And then for the actual assessment part, students who are at a lower language proficiency, a lot of my newcomers, students who've been in the country for less than 2 years, They can choose pictures, so they don't have to rely as heavily on words. Students who are mid-level, like most of my second graders are probably mid-level, um, they can choose to orally explain without having the cognitive load of writing, because I know that getting ideas from their brain to the paper can be very difficult for those students. And then for those high language proficiency kiddos, they can choose to write. Um, I do let the kids choose, so it is self differentiating for them. But as I go around and take a look at what activity they've chosen as they're working, I will usually, depending on what I know about the kid and what I know about their language, I will ask them to maybe add something that, is a little bit more challenging for them. So if they are working on the pictures, but I know that they have pretty decent language proficiency, I will ask them to maybe write to tell me about their pictures, or maybe orally explain the pictures to me. Or if they're choosing to orally explain, I might have them write just the moral, just to kind of see if they can make that transition from speaking to writing. So I will kind of differentiate from them as I observe and take notes on my checklist. The time frame for this activity, the instructional period, is typically 2 weeks, and it's really dependent on student needs. This is kind of like my assessment that I do before we decide to move on. So if students do not perform the expected way on this assessment, then we will continue to work on this for another couple weeks. But if they do, then that's my cue to kind of move forward. But I try to keep this as informal as possible. But this assessment takes up to 2 days typically. I'll give them 2 literacy periods to listen or read their fable, to complete and present their projects. Student checklist. So every student gets a checklist when they start their project. So their checklists all look the same. They all look like this because there are so many projects going on. But their checklists have all the things that they all need: retell, the beginning, the middle, the end, lesson or moral. I don't focus too much on the conventions or the spelling, because so many of my students are EL, and I want to be fair to my EL students. They're not as familiar with the conventions of English, so that's not what I'm assessing them on. I'm assessing them on their ability to retell and if they can tell me the lesson or the moral. So I give them this checklist. It has pictures that we've used in class. So if they can't read it, they can at least look at the picture and remember what was discussed. So they have all of these. All of these students are given this, and this is what they use throughout, and they will check it off as they complete each part. While students have their own checklist, I have my own. I do more anecdotal notes for this activity. I use a checklist to keep track of what students are doing as they are working. So when they are working independently, I will walk around, monitor, I have my checklist, and I will take notes and record ideas for next steps as I observe. So I put in this one all 3 parts. So I take notes on their ability to retell, on their ability to tell me the lesson and the evidence. But I also will throw in, if they're doing oral, I'll make notes on their oral presentation abilities. If they're doing visual or written, I will take notes on that as well, to go along with the language standards that I'm also assessing. So this is an example of one that I took last year. My students did this project virtually, so I took my notes digitally, which was very difficult. Typically, I just have it on a clipboard and I walk around the room. But this is an example of 2 students. The first student chose visual. I took notes on the retelling. I took notes on the lesson. I took notes on the evidence, and I noted that the evidence part was the part that she had the most difficulty with, had a difficult time verbally explaining. So that speaking part, she wasn't able to tell me about it, which ties back to those language proficiency standards. So my next steps were, more time practicing verbal explanations, thinking and reasoning, and including more modeled conversations. Um, and then my next student chose to orally explain. This student had a little bit more language proficiency than the first, and but they were still using language from the book. I noted that. Um, so I took notes on the language proficiency, and I took notes on could they identify moral, could they retell, and noted the next steps here. So after I go through each student, I will kind of go through and note the things I noted that most students are doing and need help on, and I'll include that in the next lesson. And then I'll also note things that I can address quickly in small groups. I might put a group together that needs a verbal retelling or something like that. So I use this assessment for to determine if I'm going to move on from fable and folktale, um, and also what their next steps need to be language wise that I will typically address in small groups and work with their EL teacher on. So this is an assessment I'm going to give in a couple of days, so I'm really excited to see how it goes. But overall, um, for students to be able to determine the author's purpose, to determine the author's moral or lesson, not purpose, they have to be able to understand it. So going back to these standards, they have to be able to construct the meaning and they have to be able to speak and write about it in order for me to know that they have met this Kentucky standard.